And a very warm welcome. It's good to have your company. Eat less meat, take fewer flights, ditch the gas boilers, and so on and so on and so on. We've been told we all need to make big changes to fix the climate crisis. But how do you go about changing the minds and the behaviour of billions of people? You're watching Roundtable. And it's hello from me, David Foster. What does it take to get people to do what you might consider to be the right thing? The answer to that could well play a big role in solving the current climate crisis.
Climate change is now affecting every country on the planet. The world is warming, sea levels are rising, and greenhouse gas emissions are at their highest levels in history. We've heard the warnings. To fix it, we need to act now, we've been told. And that means changing the kinds of behaviour that got us into this climate mess. Eat less meat, cut food waste, fly less, recycle more. Changes like these can help speed up the transition to a low-carbon economy. But getting people to act on the advice isn't so simple, and that's where behavioural science comes in. Clever thinking to get people to change their ways. So how do you go about giving billions of us a nudge in the right direction?
Let us get talking with Toby Park, Head of Energy and Sustainability at the Behavioural Insights team. Sian Conway with us, ethical marketing strategist. Wasn't always into the ethics, but she'll tell us why she's changed. We go to Scotland and we say hello to David Comerford, who works in behavioural science at the University of Stirling. And in Nairobi, we say hello to Nicholas Hagelberg, coordinator at the UN Climate Change Programme. Great to have you all on. Behavioural science, my shorthand is getting people to change what they do because you think it's better for everybody if they do so. So, David, let me come to you first of all. One of the things you've said is, in some circumstances, people do not act in their own best interest. Who decides what is in their interest?
People themselves recognize that they don't always follow through on what they know to be the most beneficial course of action for them. So one big insight of behavioral science is that people suffer failures of willpower. In the domain of environmental behaviors, you could think about having an intention to take the bus to work rather than drive your car. But you come out in the morning, it's drizzling, your car is sitting there in the driveway offering a nice cozy alternative. And so you get in and you might feel a little guilty about it. You might know that in the long run it's the wrong thing to do, but it's hard to resist temptation.
Okay, I want to go to willpower a little bit later on, if I may, but I want to put this suggestion to you. Telling people what is in their own interest is rather condescending.
Surely, and paternalistic. And so what we try to do as behavioral scientists is use best practice techniques to elicit what people themselves consider to be in their own best interest. So in the heat of the moment, we know that people can have skewed perspectives on costs and benefits. And there's a large body of literature showing that people's perceptions of costs and benefits and response to emotive cues and arousal can distort what, in the long run, they know is in their own best interest. So another aspect of behavioral science is trying to get accurate measures of those costs and benefits and to recognize where people have cognitive biases that will lead them to a distorted perception of benefits and costs.
Which may be, and Nicholas, let me come to you, maybe another way of saying what you've said here. Behavioral science helps people make real-life decisions on their terms and with free choice. I'll argue about the free choice on this in just a moment, but are you saying the same sort of thing that David is there?
Well, in terms of climate change, we do know that if we look at G20 countries, more than 50% of the population is keen on taking measures to address climate change. And obviously, it's a societal goal as well. So per se, it is something that is within their own belief systems and their own desires. But we all know that it's sometimes difficult to do the right thing. And as an example, perhaps I, for example, have high cholesterol, And it's not that easy to change my diet, but it's actually a little bit easier when there's a buddy or a friend that has similar problems, and then you have a little bit of that social peer pressure and support as well.
Okay, one of the examples that I was going to bring up with you, particularly since you're in Nairobi, is what the Kenyan government did when it came to an issue of climate change, if you like, and that was with plastic bags. It didn't look to persuade people. It simply said, that's it, no more plastic bags. Isn't that the better way of doing it?
So that's one way of it. So we're kind of taking the unsustainable option off the table. And there's many examples like the plastic bag ban. So we can in Europe also look at how we shifted away from being able to smoke in public spaces. So in hindsight, actually that has turned out to be a really good policy. But so removing that unsustainable option or the bad option is definitely one of the options that we have for quite quickly shifting the attitudes and behavior.
But Toby, let me ask you about something. 5 years or so ago, President Obama apparently said he told federal groups to identify policies and operations where applying findings from behavioral science could improve public welfare, etc., etc. This is at the heart of American government policy. It's presumably been adopted by other governments around the world. And your company is mentioned in it, Behavioral Insights team. It says that you use nudges. Now, what are they?
So a nudge is really any attempt to enable, support, help, encourage a particular behaviour without restricting freedom of choice. So in order to classify as a nudge, technically, it shouldn't impose any cost to going against that. So for instance, a road sign is a nudge. It helps you, it encourages you to go a certain way, but it's not imposing a material cost if you ignore it. Likewise, a calorie label is a nudge. It helps you understand what's in the food. Maybe the red, green, orange colouring actually gives you some kind of emotional response to that as well, so you automatically sort of, without needing to think about it in too detailed a way, know whether it's good for you or bad for you, but it's not precluding freedom of choice. So
are there good nudges and bad nudges?
Absolutely, yes. And we often refer to bad nudges as sludge. If you look at businesses online, for example, they can be annoying if nothing else. You get pop-ups saying 10 people in the last hour have booked this flight. That is a nudge. That is encouraging you to think, oh, maybe they're running out, or if everyone else is booking it, maybe it's a good price. I want to book it as well. That's a marketing technique,
Doesn't
but
work.
It's still a nudge. Perhaps doesn't work. I mean,
Why is it bad is what I'm trying to say.
I guess it depends on the intent behind that. Are there negative welfare impacts of that? Does it annoy people? That in itself is bad. Is it actually improving people's outcomes in life? Perhaps not. So I think really this question of whether the paternalism that comes behind nudges is right or wrong kind of depends on the intent, depends on the legitimacy of the authority
this is
deciding.
The point, isn't it? I mean, is behavioural science altruistic, which seems to be what you're suggesting? It pushes people in the right direction, and our other two guests have said the same thing. Or is it manipulative?
Well, it should be altruistic, but of course it's a set of tools, like any other tools, like regulation or incentives, any other tools of government. It could be misused, of course. So really it comes down to the ethics of practice, I would say, rather than the toolkit being inherently good or bad.
Sean, your business is ethical marketing now. It wasn't always what you did. You were in marketing straight. And isn't this just marketing by another name?
It is, because marketing at the end of the day is how you use those nudges to influence people's behaviour to get them to buy products or services. But what you're getting them to buy is the idea of who they will be when they own that product, the idea of who they will be when they use that service. But as you said, all these nudges can be used in a really manipulative way to sell things that we don't actually need. We only buy things that we perceive that we need. So marketing is about creating that need. But if you're creating that for a product or a service that somebody doesn't actually need, that isn't going to make their life better, then that could be perceived as manipulative marketing.
This is a question that will go around. I'll start with you on this one. Then we'll go to David and to Nicholas again. How do you make sure that it isn't manipulative?
I think in the marketing context, there's always going to be an element of manipulation because it's about persuading people and it's about using creative language, creative techniques to create that need for what you're selling. But for me, the ethics come into what is the end product that I'm selling. So I will only work with brands that are selling products that have an element of sustainability, a commitment to the sustainable development goals.
Let's say somebody is selling the idea of preventing further climate damage. Does it matter how that is sold as long as you say, the end result is ethical?
I think people don't like to feel like they've been manipulated, and you don't want to create buyer's remorse. So if you're creating that environment, at the end of the day, you want people to buy into that idea that actually we do need to put a stop to climate change, that we do need a more positive environment. So you don't want to use short-term manipulative techniques and then someone feel that sense of buyer's remorse that we've probably all had when we've purchased a product about this big idea, because at the end of the day, we need collective action. We need everybody on board. So I would say it does matter how you're convincing them to get involved.
I'll ask about the science of this in just a moment, because, of course, it is called behavioural science. But David, Nicholas, you first of all, David, how does this differ from being a door-to-door salesman trying to get people to buy the Encyclopedia Britannica, which could well be good for them?
I could imagine that the Encyclopedia Britannica salesman might well apply a behavioural science, but the science element of it brings in some processes that should avoid manipulation. So dignity is one aspect that's been emphasized recently in the literature. And my colleagues Liam Delaney and Leo Ladis have created the acronym For Good, summarizing 7 principles of processes and evaluation to ensure that people are not inadvertently manipulating. Another point to make on this is that nudging is no less effective generally for being transparent. And so transparency is something that is anathema to manipulation. If we're upfront about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and explaining to people and seeking their consent, then how is that manipulation?
Toby, how do you get to change people's minds? Because there are some ways I've been reading, you can say something, and even though it is pretty commonsensical that they shouldn't be doing it, they don't want to do it, but then you can put it a different way and they do.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're getting an idea of what we call confirmation bias, that we tend to gravitate towards and interpret information in a way that sort of fits with our prior views and ignore that which goes against it. So, climate denialism would be the obvious case of that. But as you suggest, framing information matters, right? So if you're trying to promote renewable energy adoption, for example, just hypothetically, you might think, well, you could promote that to one side of the political spectrum by talking about job creation, strong economy, energy independence, and so on. You could sell that to the other side of the political spectrum by talking about saving the planet. So there's different ways you can frame information, different arguments you can make to support sustainable behaviours. But I think a broader point that I would make, and I imagine my colleagues around the table would make the same point, is that changing mindsets, changing beliefs, and so on, obviously that's perhaps part of the issue here. But I think more importantly, we're concerned about actions, behaviours. It's actions and change behaviours that's ultimately going to have an impact on carbon emissions and other environmental issues. So often changing people's minds, or trying to change people's minds, A, is difficult, but B, is not the best way to change behaviour anyway. The reason being that actually our behaviours are often driven more by sort of less conscious processes, less deliberative processes, automatic responses to our environment, whether that's our social environment or our physical environment. So actually editing those aspects of our environment can be just as impactful. And that gets to the heart of nudging. I'm
going to ask you, and you, Sian, as well, perhaps, since you're both into a form of marketing, excuse me for using that term, in just a moment, to think about how you could convince me to be more energy efficient in my 350-year-old house, because if I put double glazing up, it's going to look very ugly, etc., etc. But Nicholas, let me come to you and go back to I mentioned Obama back in 2015, saying, go out, you federal agencies, use behavioural sciences. Are you seeing it being used more and more in your work with the United Nations?
Yes, definitely. So it's kind of one of the tools that are available to increase the efficiency and the impact of policies. So frankly, the effectiveness of governance, government operations. So as we can put legal frameworks in place, we can raise awareness, we can put in place financial incentives. Behavioral insights and behavioral science is one of the tools that are there for governments to use. And in that sense, Obama's policies and requests for his government to go out and use these insights is part of learning what makes the world move and how we can get to the desired results.
And have you seen any positive evidence of how this has worked to your advantage?
I would say that, for example, in some of our operations in South America, we have used these tools for enhancing the uptake of efficient lighting, so LED lights and so forth. And it's a combination of the things. So there's financial incentives, there's the easy access to the efficient lighting, and so it's a combination of things. And it was a successful project. So in that sense, it does look like it's really working.
Okay, I'll come to you for some fun examples, Toby, in just a moment, if I may, because you promised you would be able to give us some. But David, I've seen it written down that this is, quote, hacking our psychology.
I think it's in the spirit of life hacks that sort of give us shortcuts to get to where we want to be. I haven't heard that phrase, hacking our psychology, but I would interpret the phrase in that sense. Going back to your earlier point about manipulation, an example came to mind that I think gets at the fact that it can be unavoidable to manipulate people. It happens all the time without our intending to. And the example that comes to mind is the energy performance certificates that you see in estate agents' windows that have...
These are the green, yellow, red things that are sort of like a bar chart and tell you, we'll get on to energy in just a moment about my house, because I reckon I'm down the bottom.
Right. Well, one of the things that we've found in our research is that if you, when you get an audit done in your house, find that you're just close to the next threshold of getting, let's say you're in the red-green category now, but you're only 1 or 2 points shy of getting into the F category, we find that that motivates people. They are more likely to invest to boost their house into that F category. And we see this, our PhD student, Rodolfo Sayas Portillo, has looked at administrative data and finds that people apply for the energy performance certificate when they're putting their house in the market, discover that they can boost their property up, make a series of small investments, and then reapply, and the house reappears at that high.
And also they might feel guilty if their neighbours have done it. That was another thing I read. Sean, I won't ask you to sell me the double glazing or whatever it is, because I want the fun examples from you. But you're into marketing, whether it's ethical or not. It's ethical, presumably, to keep the warmth in my house rather than see it all escape. But I like the look of my house. I like the old windows. It's a bit drafty. I don't want to change it. What are you going to do about that?
See, that's a prime example of an objection that when we look at marketing any sort of product, service or idea, we look at what would your objections be, and also what is your motivation? How can I motivate you to make that change? And me sitting here saying, well, it's going to save the planet, it's going to be hassle for you, it's going to cost you money, it's going to take you time. So I need to make it actually
So how does behavioural science come into that? What would you think?
So I would look for the self-interest. So the selling the house is a really good example. If you're looking to sell your house, you might make a short-term investment at this point to get a better rating to then be able to sell it for a higher price. That's self-interest that just so happens to be good for the environment.
Okay, so you have to have the two things side by side. Yeah. It is doing good and it is doing you good.
Yeah, it's not enough that a product is just sustainable, got the sustainable label or got the eco-friendly label. That's not going to sell it to you. You know, when you think about a supermarket, for example, and the wide range of products that would be available to you, there's loads of different decisions that go into your thought process, often subconscious, to buy the product that you buy.
And I'm going to ask you about supermarkets because you mentioned them to our producer. I want to also get into choice, because I think that's a stress factor. But tell me how shops and other retail outlets have been clever like this.
Well, I think the retail sector kind of inherently understands nudging, and obviously it would be called marketing in that context. But of course, when you walk into a supermarket aisle, there's no sort of neutral way of presenting those products, right? Some of them go at the end of the aisle. Some of them go eye height versus higher up. Some of them take up more shelf space. Some of them are different colors. Packaging is different, and so on. So the point is, we are influenced. We are inevitably influenced by all of this stuff. So there's no avoiding that, and it gets.
And somebody studied this as well.
Yes, but of course, if one hasn't studied it, then it's arbitrary. But you're still influencing people in ways you don't understand, right? So I think a key argument of behavioural scientists is that, given that influence is unavoidable, you may as well structure that environment in a way that leads to positive outcomes for people in society, right? You don't necessarily want to increase the level of influence there, but if you've got to have some influence, you may as well make it so that people are making more sustainable, more healthy choices. So, in a supermarket, for instance, there have been a few studies that show that segregating the products from sort of conventional meat-oriented products to some of the new sort of plant-based alternatives, if you segregate them, put them in separate aisles, that tends to reduce sales of those plant-based products. Why? Well, if you're a meat eater, you never enter those aisles, you don't look for it, you don't come across them, and so on. So actually putting the products next to each other, putting the bean burgers next to the beef burgers, putting the soy milk next to the dairy milk, actually increases sales of those plant-based options. So that's a simple nudge that you can do to increase the sale of plant-based food. Whether that's manipulative or not, clearly the products are still available. People have the same choice, but it's just tweaking that environment.
But this is where I was getting to, or I would like to bring up now, choice. There's too much of it. That leads to stress, which in its own way is going to make you less likely to make the right choices that the behavioural scientists might want you to make. David, your thoughts?
There is a rich vein of evidence showing that people do get overwhelmed by choice. They get overwhelmed by information. And it's not just that they might make the wrong choice, but they might procrastinate and decide, I can't cope with this right now. I'll put off choosing a pension or choosing which solar panels to install or whatever that might be. And it tends to be the really high stakes decisions that get procrastinated because we have this bias of thinking that next Saturday week is going to be free, but right now I've got lots of things on my plate that I need to juggle. And of course, next Saturday week rolls around, and that morning we find we've got loads of stuff to do then. So
it's a fine line then, isn't it? You mustn't push too hard, but if you don't push hard enough, if you don't nudge, then you're going to get nowhere.
I think in certain domains that's the case. I think there are lots of situations where it's safe to rely on people acting in their own interest, but we're accumulating a body of evidence as to which specific circumstances people struggle with. And choice, you've identified one there in saying that we're overloaded by choice in certain domains. And so in those domains where it's really important to make a choice, such as choosing a pension, for example, there might be a role for legislators to filter that choice so that it's more digestible when we come into contact with the range of options available.
Nicholas, this program, I don't know, you can see the thing behind me, but it says Roundtable Net Zero. It's all about how far we're going and what is feasible in terms of reducing the damage we're causing to this planet. Do you think this form of behavioural science will do that, and will it become more refined?
So if I look across the main sectors that we need to kind of decarbonize to kind of meet the 1.5 degree target. So we're talking energy, we're talking industry, agriculture, forestry, transport, and buildings. I would say for all of those sectors, there are real opportunities for using nudges, behavioral insights, and kind of shifting that behavior towards decarbonization. And you just talked about choice. So default value is a major tool in shifting behavior, because again, we're a little bit lazy as a species, and we tend to go for the easiest solution. So default values, for example, if airline would put carbon offsets as a default value when you buy tickets, it would really skyrocket the enrollment into those offsets.
So a little bit like, I suppose, and we'll come to you on this one, Sean, a little bit like sort of the organ donation scheme where opting out is now the default in this country, at least, rather than having to opt in, and we've seen organ donations go up massively as a result. I said at the beginning, you're a marketing ethicist, which means that you will only go down certain ways and you will only use certain principles. Are you seeing more and more people adopting your method to try and get the changes that we all want to see in this world?
Yes, but we're also seeing a rise in greenwashing. So marketers and brands using these techniques to look more sustainable and eco-friendly than they are, and spending more money on the PR and the kind of end result, which is the marketing campaigns, rather than changing the system that's there. So sticking a sustainable label on it and putting it out there, and consumers are busy, you don't have time to research what that means, so you're going to buy it because you think you're doing good. So
There's
I think
a lot of
that's
lying
the
out
worry.
there still, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is it difficult to tell?
it is difficult to tell as, you know, the average consumer who's busy and has to make all of these different purchasing decisions in a day. You haven't got time to research all of those. So I think we do need that system change to back it up.
Which brings me nicely round to how do you tell the climate change do-gooder, and I use that word advisedly because in the nicest possible way, it is somebody who wants to do good, but it has another connotation as well. How do you tell that that person is ethical?
Well, it's subjective, isn't it? At the end of the day, we all have our own frames of reference and our own influences over what we believe is right and wrong. But I think when it comes to the sustainability side, it's very clear in terms of emissions and in terms of these net zero targets, actually what actions we need to be taking and what the right course of action is.
Okay. Listen, Nicholas, thank you very much indeed. David, good luck with your work up at Stirling University, lovely part of Scotland. Thank you for coming in. Lovely in Nairobi. I know you told me the rain is coming down at the moment, but it won't always be like that. What a wonderful country. Listen, thank you very much for watching this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, from the team that made this possible. Goodbye for now.